Everybody, it's Joe from the F-Stops here. Just want to do a quick introduction to the video today. We're going to take a look at really understanding in some detail the curves tool. And this is going to be applicable to any software that you use with the curves tool. So we're going to see this in Lightroom, but it's the same understanding in Capture One and the same understanding in Photoshop. The video is actually a clip from a new class that I have on Udemy, Macro Photography 0 to 60. This is a 3-hour course that I have just launched, and it takes you from beginning through shooting, through editing, and through focus stacking, if you choose to do that, the entire process of macro photography. I'm very proud of it, and I'll leave links for it inside of the description. Without further ado, let's look at curves. So the tone curve is the most feared tool in photo editing, in my experience, but it's also the most powerful. And it's actually a little bit strange to look at when you first look at it, and a lot of people use it without really understanding what it is. The key to understanding the tone curve, which by the way is in every photo editing software that I have looked at, so it's ubiquitous, it's something you're going to have access to independent of your software, is that this is a graph representing input and output values. I'll say it again. What we see here is a graph that represents what's called input and output values. What are input and output values? Well, let's talk about it. So down here, I will always see input and output. But we need to understand what value is first. We assign brightnesses a value in photography. Pure black has a value of 0, and pure white has a value of 255. So if this tool does nothing, then the input value and the output value would be the same, meaning that a brightness value was recorded, we did not change it, and so the output would be the same value as before. Look at the graph. The x-axis is the input value. The y-axis is the output value. Now what I want you to think about is if we were to just graph the equation x equals y on just any standard graphing space, we would get a line at 45 degrees because input equals output. And indeed, if I take my cursor and I hover over the line right there, we can see the input is 187. That's the value of the pixels at this space. And the output is 187 because I haven't done anything with the tone curve yet. So if I was to change a brightness value, it would come in at some value, but it would leave at a different value. Okay, so that is how we can read and understand it, but what can we do with it? And the answer is quite a bit. But first, let me show you what the exposure slider does. When we move an exposure slider, a basic exposure or brightness slider, and I brighten it, what happens, do you see that the exposures move proportionately to each other? Okay, what's happening is this. When I brighten through an exposure slider, the entire image gets brighter all at once. And we actually measure it in stops. So this is 2.5 stops brighter. And what's happening here is the entire image is getting brighter as if I had shot the picture at that exposure value. I'll say it again. When we move an exposure slider, we make the whole image brighter as if we had shot the picture at that exposure value. Now, we're going to contrast that with the tone curve. What if I was to grab the middle point here and brighten? I'm taking the value of 95 and I'm outputting it at 178. Larger number is brighter. So I've brightened up from this point. Now, why is it called a tone curve? Because if I was to only take the values that were exactly 95 and brighten them, and brighten nothing else, it would be very strange. The effect needs to be feathered into the image so that it blends and so that it looks like a good photograph. But please notice I have other anchoring points. I have made an anchoring point here at 95. And I can move from the value of 95. And I can also drag it up here. I'm using the value of 125, 126, whatever. And I can brighten from that point. Okay? So I can change my anchoring point. Right now I've got an input of 103, but I am outputting it at 176. That's what this setting means. But take a look at the other points I have. One here, one here. In fact, I'll reset this so that you can see it. When we reset a tone curve, or when we come into it for the first time, 2 points are already created, 2 anchoring points. 255 defined as 255, which actually showed up there for us when we hovered over that anchoring point. And here is 0 defined as 0. Now that is an anchoring point. If I was to brighten this image up, in this case, an input of 104, in fact I can hover over it, and I have output at 157, look at what happened with the feathering. It trails down to meet the other anchoring points. In other words, 255 is still defined as 255, and 0 is still defined as 0. I have brightened from the center, but I have still anchored my white point and my black point. That is fundamentally different than just making the whole image brighter or darker proportionately and allowing it to start clipping once pixels reach that value. By the way, little term for you, when a pixel touches the wall of a histogram, we begin losing information or detail information specifically as we get pure black and pure white pixels respectively. That's called clipping. With tone curve, since I have anchored 0 at 0 and 255 at 255, I actually wind up with an image that has brightened without overexposing the bright areas or going too dark on the dark areas. So just that 1 point being lifted is a fundamentally different way of editing from the exposure slider. And we're not done yet. We'll come back to the tone curve and we'll just reset it, which is sometimes called a linear distribution because it's x equals y, so linear. They call it a linear curve. It doesn't curve. And let's talk about setting white point and black point, and this is also referred to as remapping. So you'll notice with by the way, you'll notice that this right here, this overlaid thing, is the histogram squished into a square. Okay, that's what that is. It's this shape here, but it's only the density one. Don't look at the red, green, and blue. It's just the density one, but squished into a square. All right, that's what that is. And we can see that I have my black point really is touching my black point there, but I have very few brighter values. In other words, my brightest values are probably right around here, probably in the 225 or so region, but I am still remapping right here, or mapping my white point as white, but I don't have to. What if I wanted my brightest value to be the brightest value possible? Well, I could take this already extant point right here and drag it to about, what did I say, 225 or so? There it is. And now what I've done, just by taking this point in, is I've made my brightest pixel into the brightest pixel possible. And everything brighter than 255 will automatically be output at 255. This is called remapping. And this is not the best image for me to show you this on, so let me grab a different one here. I'm going to grab this image right here. Okay? Or do I want to do this one? Yeah, let's do this one. This is fine. So I can bring in my white point, and I can bring in my black point. And now my darkest value is the darkest value possible, and my brightest value is the brightest value possible. Okay, I can do this here as well. If I just bring this in, I've remapped my brightest value to the brightest value possible. And that is going to automatically add contrast to the image, because now I am definitely, with my image, going from a pure black to a pure white. And then I can brighten from the middle. And that, just that little trick, is a really nice way of doing an edit. So here I'll bring in my white point to right about there. Let's call it 230. And now I have values ranging from pure white, 255. In fact, that drifted down to 253. I need to lift it up, 255 right there. And I'm remapping from about 228. So let me take that, I think that way. And then I already have a black value at 0, so I can just leave that there, a 0 mapped at 0. Then I can make a point in the middle and lift, and that is a simple way of having contrast and brightness to the image without clipping highlights or shadows. But what if I want to have more contrast than that? Well, at that point, I can do a 2-point S-curve where I brighten from the bright areas, but I can also add a point in the dark areas and drift it lower. And now what I have, before, after, is darkening the dark values, brightening the bright values, but I've also remapped white and black to match the image. I can actually do a shocking amount of editing just with the tone curve, and I haven't even touched the exposure sliders yet. But if I wanted to lift a little bit of shadows, drop a little bit of black point, maybe lift exposure a little bit, I very well might do so. And that's before and after, and I think that adds a little bit. So we can work with overall exposure, we can work with tone curve, and I'll give you this secret. There is no edit I do at all anymore that does not involve tone curve, ever. It doesn't matter the software I'm working in, it doesn't matter the type of image. There is no edit I do that does not include tone curve because of how powerful it is for remapping purposes, for having a brightness adjustment that still will avoid clipping in highlights and shadows. And we, of course, if we have some kind of drifting of color, we could come into the color regions. For instance, if I was shooting an image and I felt that the skin tone was too red, I could come into the red color channel and pull that back and make it more blue if I wanted to. I don't think that's the issue with this image, but we certainly could.